He was a man who had everything the world could offer. Wealth beyond imagination, power that could make nations bend, and a lifestyle so grand that most people could only dream about it. He owned skyscrapers that kissed the sky, businesses that spread across continents, and a name that carried both respect and fear. Yet, despite all of this, he lived with a hollowness that even his fortune could not fill. He believed money was the ultimate key to life, the solution to every problem, the force that could command loyalty, silence pain, and create happiness. But life has a way of testing even the strongest beliefs, and his moment came the day he crossed paths with a woman who would change everything. She was not rich. Her clothes were plain, her hands bore the marks of hard work, and her life was a daily struggle. Yet she walked with dignity, her head held high even though the world had never given her much. Unlike the billionaire who measured worth in dollars and deals, she measured life in moments of truth, in the strength it took to wake up every morning and fight for survival. She was not afraid of hardship because it had shaped her. She was not afraid of people because she had already faced the worst of judgment. Most importantly, she was not afraid of him, the man whose very name made others bow. Their first encounter was nothing spectacular in the eyes of others, just a brief crossing of paths. But for him it was unsettling in a way he could not explain. She looked at him not with fear or admiration, but with a quiet strength, as if she saw through all the layers of power and wealth that he wore like armor. It was the first time in years that someone did not treat him like a god or a monster. She treated him like a man, and though he would never admit it aloud, that struck him harder than any boardroom defeat ever had. He found himself curious. Who was this woman who did not tremble before him, who carried herself as if she had nothing yet lacked nothing? For him, power was a weapon, a tool to bend the world. For her, strength was simply a necessity to survive. When he spoke, his words carried weight, but when she spoke, her words carried truth. And for a man who was surrounded by liars and flatterers, that truth was more valuable than gold. The more he observed her, the more restless he became. He realized how different their worlds were. He had never known hunger. She had fought it countless times. He had never known loneliness. She had endured it and still stood tall. He had never faced betrayal without revenge. She had faced betrayal and forgiven. In her struggles she had built a strength that his billions could never buy. And though he would not admit it, something inside him stirred, a recognition that despite all his riches he was the poorer of the two. For her he was nothing but another man. She had no desire for his wealth, no hunger for his fame, and no interest in being part of his world. She had her own battles to fight, her own dignity to protect. But fate has its way of weaving two lives together, when they least expect it. Though their first meeting was brief, it left an impression so deep that neither of them could forget it. For him it was the beginning of an unsettling realization, that the life he had built might not be the life he truly wanted. For her it was nothing more than a passing moment. But moments have power, and this one was destined to grow into something much greater. He went back to his mansion surrounded by luxury, but her image stayed in his mind. The way she looked at him without fear, the way she stood with quiet strength, the way her presence reminded him of something real he had long forgotten. It disturbed him. For the first time in years, he questioned himself. Was wealth truly the answer to life, or was there something more? He could not name it yet, but deep inside a seed had been planted, a seed that would slowly break through the stone walls he had built around his heart. This was only the beginning. The billionaire, who once thought he could buy the world, had unknowingly stepped into a story where money meant nothing and strength meant everything. And though he did not know it yet, that one encounter with a woman of unshakable courage would transform his heart in ways he had never imagined. The billionaire had always lived under the illusion that his wealth was the greatest weapon a man could possess. Where he went, doors opened without question. Whenever he spoke, people listened with reverence or fear. He was accustomed to seeing people bow their heads, desperate for his approval or afraid of his rejection. He measured life in power, and power, to him, had always meant money. He had never met someone who challenged that belief until her. When their paths crossed again, it was not by chance. He had been curious, restless, haunted by the memory of her quiet defiance. Something about the way she had stood tall with nothing to her name but her dignity disturbed him in a way he could not explain. He had to see her again. He told himself it was curiosity, perhaps even amusement. But deep down he knew it was more than that. He approached her with the same confidence that had conquered boardrooms and silenced rivals. His words carried the arrogance of a man who knew he was untouchable. Yet she did not flinch. She looked him in the eyes and spoke with honesty so sharp it cut through his pride. She told him money could not buy respect, that true strength was not found in the weight of a bank account, but in the courage to face life when everything seemed impossible. Her voice was steady, her eyes unshaken. For the first time in his life, his wealth felt small, his power fragile. He tried to test her. He offered help, gifts that would have dazzled anyone else. But she refused. Not out of pride alone, but out of principle. She had lived her life fighting battles that no one else fought for her. Accepting charity from a man who thought money was the solution to all things was something she could never allow herself to do. She told him that strength comes from standing on your own 2 feet, from refusing to let life break you even when it tried with all its might. Her words lingered in his mind, long after their conversation ended. He, who had grown up believing that power could bend the will of any human being, was shaken. Here was a woman with no fortune, no influence, no protection, and yet she stood taller than any of the billionaires, politicians, or leaders he had ever met. She did not need the world's approval to know her worth. She did not need his wealth to feel powerful. Her strength came from within, and it was a kind of strength he had never known. The more he tried to understand her, the more unsettled he became. He began to see the cracks in his own empire, the emptiness behind the applause of people who praised him only because they needed him. He realized that those who surrounded him were bound by money, not loyalty. They would vanish the moment his wealth disappeared. But she had no reason to stand tall except her own will, no reason to fight except her love for the people she cared about. That realization shook him to his very core. She became, unknowingly, a mirror to his soul. Through her he began to see what he had become. A man feared but never loved, respected but never trusted, wealthy but never truly rich. The world had taught him to measure life in terms of gains and losses, but she measured it in courage and truth. For the first time he wondered which of them was truly powerful. The man with billions at his command, or the woman who had nothing but her unbreakable spirit. The battles she fought were not the kind he could understand. He had armies of lawyers to fight his wars, entire companies to protect his interests. She had none of that. Her battles were for survival, for dignity, for her family. They were not fought with contracts or investments but with resilience, sacrifice, and an unyielding heart. And it was in those battles that she had forged a strength that he, with all his fortune, had never been able to buy. In her presence his arrogance began to falter. He tried to speak with authority, but she answered with truth. He tried to impress her with power, but she remained unimpressed. He tried to offer her ease, but she valued her struggle more than his comfort. It was maddening and humbling at the same time. For once he was the one left speechless. What unsettled him most was the way she made him question himself. He had never doubted his path, never wondered if there was something more to life than the chase for wealth. Yet now every word she spoke felt like a challenge to everything he believed in. Her courage shook the foundation of his empire in a way that no rival, no competitor, had ever been able to do. For her, these exchanges were nothing extraordinary. She was not trying to change him, nor did she think of him as someone to be impressed by. She was simply living the only way she knew how, standing firm in her truth, no matter how hard life became. But for him, every moment with her was a revelation, a crack in the armor he had built around his heart. And so the man who believed that power meant bending others to his will began to realize that real power was something else entirely. It was the strength of a woman who had faced the world with nothing but her courage and had refused to break. It was not the power of control but the power of resilience. And deep inside, though he fought against it, he knew that he was beginning to change. The billionaire had never been a man to doubt himself. His decisions were sharp, his instincts always profitable, and his will unshakable. But ever since that woman entered his life, something inside him had begun to shift. The walls he had built around his heart, walls of arrogance, pride and wealth, were beginning to crack. He tried to ignore it, convincing himself that it was nothing but passing curiosity. Yet the truth was undeniable. She had awakened something within him that he had long buried, something he was almost afraid to feel. Day after day he found his thoughts drifting back to her. In the middle of high-level meetings where millions of dollars were at stake, he would remember the way her voice carried honesty without fear. Surrounded by lavish parties filled with people desperate for his attention, he thought of how she needed nothing from him. And when he returned to his mansion, where every luxury money could buy surrounded him, he could not forget the simplicity in which she lived, carrying herself with dignity and strength that no gold could outshine. It was maddening to him. For years he had believed that money defined worth, that power profaned strength. Yet here she was, a woman with none of his wealth, none of his influence, and somehow she had more control over his heart than he had over his entire empire. She didn't seek his approval, didn't care about his fortune, and yet her presence lingered like a quiet storm in his life. He felt vulnerable, a feeling he had always despised, but beneath that vulnerability was something deeper, something he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Longing. He began to see the world differently. The boardrooms that once gave him pride now felt cold and empty. The endless praise from his employees sounded hollow, their words lacking the sincerity he now craved. The people who surrounded him seemed like shadows, moving only because his wealth kept them there. He had spent his whole life chasing respect, but now he realized most of it was fear, not love. And then he thought of her. How she spoke the truth without hesitation. how she looked him in the eye without trembling, how her strength was not borrowed from anyone but built through her own struggles. She who had nothing was richer in spirit than he had ever been. The transformation in his heart was slow, but undeniable. He found himself caring about things he had never noticed before. The faces of the poor on the streets, the struggles of his workers, the emptiness in the eyes of people who pretended to adore him. All of it suddenly mattered. He began to understand what she had meant when she said that strength was not about wealth, but about enduring. When the world tried to break you, for the first time in his life he wanted to be more than a man with money. He wanted to be a man with meaning. But with this transformation came conflict. The society he belonged to, the world of power, politics and greed, did not accept change easily. To them he was not a man, but an institution, someone untouchable, someone whose role was to dominate, not to soften. His newfound thoughts felt dangerous, as if even a hint of them could unravel the empire he had built. The very people who praised him would turn on him if they sensed he was no longer the man of steel they believed him to be. He was caught between two worlds, the cold empire that demanded he remain ruthless, and the woman whose courage pulled him toward humanity. For her nothing had changed. She continued to live her life, fighting her battles with the same determination as always. She had no idea of the storm she had created inside him. She never asked for his attention, never sought his wealth, never played the games that so many others did to win his favor. Perhaps that was what drew him even more. She was real in a world full of illusions. The more he fought his feelings, the stronger they grew. He wanted to be near her, to hear her voice, to understand the strength that radiated from her every word and action. She had become more than inspiration. She had become a weakness, a longing, a light in the darkness of his existence. Yet he knew that to follow his heart would not be easy. The walls of society, the weight of his empire, and his own pride stood tall between them. But something inside him whispered that no empire, no fortune, no power could ever compare to the value of what he was beginning to feel. And though he had not yet admitted it aloud, he knew he was standing on the edge of a decision that could change his life forever. The billionaire, once defined by his wealth, was slowly being redefined by his heart. And that heart now beat in rhythm with the strength of a woman who had unknowingly become his greatest truth. The weight of his decision hung heavy in his chest like a storm waiting to break. For so long the billionaire had lived in a world where choices were dictated by profit, where sacrifices were calculated only in numbers, and where his heart had no say in the life he built. But now, that heart, the very thing he had silenced for years, was louder than ever. Every beat reminded him of her, of the woman who had shown him a truth money could never buy. It terrified him, yet at the same time it gave him a sense of freedom he had never known. He began to realize that love was not a transaction. It could not be bought, bargained or controlled. It demanded vulnerability, sacrifice and courage, the very things he had avoided his entire life. But when he thought of her, of the strength she carried in the face of hardship, of the fire in her spirit that refused to be extinguished, he understood what he had to do. For the first time he was ready to put aside the empire, the pride, the walls he had lived behind. For the first time he was ready to risk everything for something that could not be measured in wealth, love. It was not easy. The moment people saw the shift in him, they questioned, doubted, and even mocked. His closest advisors warned him that pursuing her would be a mistake, that society would never accept it, that he was risking his reputation and legacy for a woman who had nothing to offer but her courage. But their words no longer mattered. The very people advising him were the same ones who had always tied their loyalty to his fortune. He could lose all of them tomorrow, and they would vanish without hesitation. But her, she was different. She had no reason to stand by him except for what she saw in his soul. That was the kind of loyalty and truth he had searched for his entire life without even realizing it. When he finally stood before her, he was not the man the world knew. He was not the billionaire draped in power and arrogance. He was simply a man stripped of his armor, a man who had finally learned that true strength did not come from dominating others, but from allowing himself to be changed by love. His voice trembled in a way it never had before as he confessed that she had opened his eyes, that she had given him a reason to become more than what money could define. He told her that wealth without meaning was emptiness, and that he no longer wanted to be the man who lived only for himself. For her, his words were not easy to accept. She had lived long enough to know that promises often faded, that wealth had a way of corrupting even the best of intentions. But when she looked into his eyes, she did not see the coldness of a man who wanted to own the world. She saw a man struggling, breaking and rebuilding himself for the sake of something real. She saw sincerity where there once was only arrogance. She saw a heart that had been asleep for too long and had finally awakened. It was not a fairy tale moment. There were still walls to climb, still challenges ahead, still the judgment of a society that thrived on separation. But standing there, she realized that love was not meant to be easy. Love was meant to be strong enough to endure storms, brave enough to face sacrifices, and true enough to survive where everything else failed. And so, with quiet courage, she allowed herself to believe in him, not because of his wealth, not because of the empire he offered, but because of the man he had chosen to become. Together they stepped into a future uncertain yet full of possibility. For him it was the greatest risk he had ever taken, not an investment of money but of the heart. For her it was the acknowledgement that strength was not only about standing alone but also about allowing someone to stand beside you. Their story was not about riches or power, nor was it about fairy tale perfection. It was about transformation, about a man discovering his humanity and a woman proving that courage could move even the wealthiest of hearts. In the end, the world still saw him as a billionaire. But those who truly knew his story understood the truth. He was a man reborn, not by fortune, but by love. And she, the woman who had faced life with nothing but strength, had shown that love built on equality, respect, and truth could rewrite even the most powerful of destinies. Together they proved that when a billionaire's heart meets a woman's strength, the world itself can change.